Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your Twitter feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, the author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And I'm V.V. Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Love Marriage.
So how's your 401k?
We don't talk about the 401k. I'm afraid to look.
It's really weird. I mean, we have never once in our relationship talked about retirement funds or your retirement fund or mine, even though we both work at universities that provide at least a minimum matching funds for the 401k, because writers don't like to talk about money, or at least they don't like to talk about their own money.
Also, they think that they're going to work until they just die.
Well, you can kind of, until your brain goes. All right. So, but look, but writing is a totally capitalist profession, so it's like one of the most, capitalist professions that could possibly exist on the face of the earth. And so I wonder why there is that kind of reluctance.
Hold on a second. So when exactly did writing literary fiction become a huge capitalist enterprise? Are you raking it in and you're just not talking about it?
Would you go along with Jonathan Franzen and refuse to be part of Oprah's book club if she came and called about you, to want to have your novel on?
Would you?
No. I mean, because look, being a writer is like being a professional golfer. It's the most, even, like lawyers, like you've got a firm, but like you're a totally independent operator. If you write stuff that sells, you get to write another thing. If you don't, you eventually don't get to write stuff anymore. There's no support network at all.
And this is why writers don't talk about money.
It's too depressing.
The first rule of Writer Money Club is don't talk about Writer Money Club.
But today we're going to break that rule and talk exclusively about money and specifically booms. Will there be a Biden boom? Do different kinds of books get published during booms? Later in the episode, we'll talk to the author of Gold Diggers, Sanjana Sathian, about the sort of literature we see during economic booms, as well as how Americans imagine wealth, ambition, and luck.
But first, we're going to talk to Carolin Benack. Carolin is a PhD candidate at Duke University and studies the intersection of fiction and economics. Her dissertation traces economic thought in both novels and economics departments of the late 19th and early 20th century United States. She holds a master's degree in North American Studies with concentrations in literature and economics from the Free University of Berlin, and is the author of numerous articles on the intersection of economics and literature, including Economists are more like storytellers than scientists. Don't let the Nobel for Economic Sciences fool you, which was published in Commentary. Carolin, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
It's very nice to have you. When I read your piece comparing economists to novelists, I felt like I was discovering someone who absolutely had to be on this podcast. Economics, of course, it shares more with fiction writing than with science. That seems obvious to me, but I don't think a lot of other people feel that way. Your article came on that Sugi mentioned on storytelling and economics came out in October of 2020, but seems totally relevant to the economic storytelling that's going on right now in the first term of the Biden administration. Could you read to us from that piece just to set things up?
Sure. So, I mean, I wrote this piece in October, in the lead up to the Nobel Prize announcements, but kind of just the two arguments I'm making are one, that economics relies very heavily on fiction. And I don't mean that in the sense of it's mere fiction. I mean that fiction is has very real impact on how people imagine the world. And secondly, that paradoxically, economics has used that very mechanism of fiction to make itself look more like the hard sciences, when in fact it is a social science. And I think that distinction is important. Okay, let me read. The notion that economics shares a lot with fiction may seem counterintuitive. That feeling is not incidental. Ever since the inception of economics in the late 1800s, economists have sought to associate their discipline with the very opposite of fiction, the natural sciences. Unlike economics, which deals with human relationships, the hard sciences study phenomena in the natural world. As such, a claim by a natural scientist reflects a different kind of truth than one by an economist. For example, the law of gravity describes an immutable physical fact. The law of supply and demand describes a relationship between people. What we know now as mainstream economics began with the concept of marginal utility, which posits that individuals make purchases by considering how much happiness they will derive from each additional unit of a good or service. What attracted many economists to the concept was that it provided a way to make economics more mathematical. The concept of marginal utility allowed economists to turn sensations into quantities. Happiness, or satisfaction, or utility was imagined as a pile of many little units of pleasure, which some economists actually believed could be physically measured. Francis Edgeworth, for example, conceived of a psychophysical machine, as he called it, to do precisely that in his beautifully titled book, Mathematical Psychics. That is to say, in the 19th century, the resemblance of economics to the natural sciences fooled even some of its own practitioners. Economic theory, the stuff that makes economists look at the numbers the way they do, is an endeavor that fundamentally relies on our understanding of fiction. Literary scholar Catherine Gallagher has argued that this understanding, at least in the Anglo-Saxon world, was shaped by a relatively new genre in the 18th century, the novel. Readers previously thought of fiction as clearly marked fantastic stories, think flying carpets and talking animals, and perceived stories that appeared plausible enough, but that they could have happened as lies. Novels shifted that perception. We can now read a realist novel and at once know that the story did not actually happen and put that knowledge on hold to follow along. Models of economic theory require the same suspension of disbelief. We know that there is no world with perfect competition, as one famous economic theory asserts. So we're asked to set aside the criteria we would usually apply to understand something as objectively real to follow the story the theory and economist tells about the economy. In other words, with the novel first teaching us how to deal with worlds that are not technically true, but still believable, theoretical models might not exist in the way they do today. This reliance on our attitude toward fiction is not exclusive to the models used in economics. The same could be said about, for example, the idea of a perfect vacuum in physics. We know there's no perfectly empty space, yet we can imagine it. Where economics becomes more fictional than other academic disciplines is in the content of its theories, specifically in one of its most fundamental assumptions, opportunity cost. According to economic textbooks, individuals make choices by considering how much happiness they derive from different options. Say I have an hour I could use to either buy groceries, catch up with a friend, or take a nap. I assess my options and find that grocery shopping is not that important right now. Seeing my friend would be nice, but napping really promises the largest amount of happiness. Consequently, I choose to nap, but the price I pay for my nap is the happiness I would have derived from my second best option, spending time with my friend. Note that the second best option did not and will not occur, and the individual in the story knows this as she is imagining her options. In other words, fiction occupies a very prominent position in the opportunity cost story, and by extension, in economics at large. Each decision we make, economists are saying, is accompanied by a piece of fiction. Economists today are aware that their discipline is a social science rather than the study of physical laws of nature. Yet, they're unlikely to object to the prestige that comes along with the lingering perception of economics as a hard science. I believe the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences, announced on October 12th, is an example of this prestige production. If the other research-based Nobel Prizes go to physicists, chemists, and medical scientists, economists must have the same claim to being a scientist, right? Recognizing instead that economics shares a lot with literature, another Nobel category, helps us because it loosens the perception of the discipline as a hard science that tells us facts of nature. Understanding economists' comments and predictions this way also gives all of us more agency to decide whether or not a given story seems credible.
Thank you. I really love that napping hypothetical, one to which I suspect everyone can relate. We were going to call this show What Happens in the Biden Boom, because 10 days ago, the story from Economist was that the economy was set for a huge boom as businesses were set to reopen, virus numbers were dropping in the US, and Biden's first stimulus bill was hitting people's pocketbooks. And then on Friday, May 7th, about a week ago, we're recording on Friday, May 14th, we got a whole new story. And the US Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that non-farm payroll employment rose by 266,000 in April, which is way less than the million new jobs that economists were predicting. Suddenly, everyone was talking about lazy workers and predicting recession. I feel like I've even seen this floating around social media, the kind of notion that people, you can't find workers. It's too difficult. I know you critique the stories that economists tell, but to start off, can we just sort of establish what their story is and why it changed so quickly?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to give you like the kind of stuff you would learn maybe in an economics class, but like a lot of that trickles.
Good, because I dropped mine in college.
Maybe because people didn't tell you enough that they're actually telling stories. And
I would have been much more interested. What we were doing was very boring.
I mean, this is a side note, but I have TA'd in economics before, and I always made it very clear that I'm coming to this from a literary perspective because I think it makes more people interested in economics and more people who maybe normally wouldn't study economics, which, as we know, economics has a huge diversity problem. I think might be induced to take a look at it if we highlighted a little more the storytelling aspect.
Yeah, I think Bernanke and Yellen could like use some time in workshop. Maybe we could go over their things and see what other people have to say. They could listen to comments before when they decide something that they're going to say something about the economy.
They think about it a lot, but yes, they definitely need some novelists on their staff. But back to the question. What are the narratives that kind of are behind the question, behind first, like the idea that, oh, yay, here's the stimulus, now we're going to have a Biden boom. And then a week later, everything changed. So on the one hand, economists kind of like it when money goes to people who don't have a lot of money to some degree, because the idea is if you're someone who really is living hand to mouth and you're having trouble putting putting food on the table, any dollar that the government gives you will be spent. And so it's a very direct kind of payment to the American economy, kind of if you give it to people who don't have the capacity to save. But then there's the other story, where the idea is that once you have that kind of consumption increase because people are buying more things, you will also, that's kind of a subsidy for businesses as well, and they will start hiring more workers. Now, here's where we get into the second story, the kind of competing story, which is if you give pretty high unemployment benefits, workers will be less induced, or the recipients of these benefits will have less of an incentive to go back to work. Because if you're a rational recipient of an unemployment benefits and you get, say, $600 a week, why would you go to a job that pays $12 an hour, where with 40 hours a week, you'd be getting $480? So, and we're talking very.
Or I start getting angry about that part, because I feel like the entire point of, well, we're going to get to this later, but the point is for wages to go up. They should go up. They need to go up, right? They have stayed the same, and particularly in service industry jobs, for a long time. And we refuse to raise the minimum wage. And then suddenly when wages go up, everyone's like, oh my God.
I mean, we will talk more about this.
Yeah. Okay. No, I got excited there. I'm sorry.
I get very excited about this too. I try to not show it too much, but yes. There is a different way you could tell that very same story, right? About unemployment benefits being up, this is a story that usually the proponents of like a universal basic income would be telling, which is, well, if unemployment is high, and when we're saying high, we just mean like basic human dignity is ensured in the amount of money someone makes. So if unemployment is high, companies have to compete for workers, and that means that wages will rise. So, which is exactly what we're seeing. That very same job report had showed a 21-cent increase, which doesn't sound like that much, but it's on average. And I suspect that we're going to see even more of a raise in wages in the low wage sector.
So following the bad jobs number, which was so bad that Biden gave a national address about it, the consumer price index hit a 13-year high in a report that was released yesterday, May 13th, and the stock market tanked. Why do economists in the stock market fear inflation so much? And why would the stock market tank when high inflation is actually a marker that the economy is running hot?
So, I mean, inflation just means the purchasing power of your money goes down. The same dollar that you have today buys you a little less than the dollar you had yesterday. That's the basic definition. And because of that, we can already see that economists wouldn't really want that, especially if you just, say if you're a government economist and you just put $1.9 trillion into the economy. Wow, okay, those $1.9 trillion are now worth a lot less because you put it into the economy, right? But really, macroeconomists especially have been worried about inflation since the 1970s, when we saw kind of the bust of another very famous, within economics, a very famous story, which is the story of the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve basically said that there's an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation, meaning if inflation is high, we can expect unemployment to be low. This was basically just a correlation that an economist, A.W. Phillips, found in some of the historical data he was looking at. But the Fed especially thought they could use that as a kind of tool. They could be like, yeah, we can, crank up inflation if unemployment doesn't look so good. In the 1970s, we came to a period, to a recession that then where we saw both high unemployment and high inflation, and that left monetary policy with very little to do. So really the reason that economists don't like high inflation is that they're worried that really then on a monetary policy level, they can't really do much about it. Now, I have to qualify this a little bit by saying that the Fed can't directly manipulate inflation. What the Fed can do is set the interest rate, or at least one interest rate that is very influential. And they have been setting it very low. Now, the thing is, stock markets usually love low interest rates because investors have a low interest rate means money is cheap and more people can invest. Great for the stock market. But basically, we've been kind of in this experiment this past decade where interest rates have been extremely low. And we've been kind of trying to see, okay, for how long can we keep interest rates really low and basically stimulate investment without seeing inflation rise significantly. And so that's really kind of the paradox of the stock market. The very thing that they like, which is low interest rates, can cause the thing that they don't like, which is inflation.
And low interest rates have other consequences, like you have to invest in the stock market if there's low interest rates because you can't buy a CD or something safer, right? Because you don't get any return on your investment. And normally during periods of economic prosperity, the Fed's supposed to bring the interest rate up so that they can drop it if something bad happens. We're kind of stuck here. If anything bad happens, we're screwed, is what it feels like to me. Anyway, all right. So we've asked you to speak in the voice of the economists, telling us what they think, which is not exactly what you think, I don't think. And it's certainly not what I think. So now we're going to do the critique part. And we want to start by deconstructing this story that I heard on CNBC show Fast Money on May 12th. This is an exchange between one of the regular panelists, Guy Adami, and Bank of America's head of U.S. equity and quantitative strategy, Savita Subramanian.
Guy Adami. 8 million, 9 million job openings out there. Seemingly, employers can't get people in those jobs, but they will if they raise pay. And we saw it anecdotally when Chipotle said they were going to raise wages to $15. Is the market going to raise the minimum wage for the politicians? And is that the final piece of the inflation puzzle, wage inflation?
All right, here's Savita Subramanian. Oh, absolutely. So this is the key reason we downgraded the consumer discretionary, I'm sorry, these things make me laugh, to sector to underweight about a week and a half ago, is the idea that the companies that are most impacted by minimum wage inflation are actually a lot of these service companies, retailers. And that's where you're going to see margin compression. This is sort of a typical mid-cycle type of market where you start to see upward pressure on rates, on commodity prices, on wages. We as investors should avoid some of the stocks that have chronically seen margin pressure coming into a wage inflationary environment. So I would avoid consumer discretionary stocks. Those are the primary culprit. The sales to labor ratio of those companies is the lowest we've seen across all sectors. So that's one casualty of wage inflation.
Wow. I mean, first off, the language is so obviously designed to not be
to not say, hey, stop buying these companies because wages are going to go up and rich people will have a harder time making money this way, is how I read that.
That's absolutely correct. The thing, but it shows you how powerful language is that makes it really hard to penetrate. The thing is, here's the thing about what Adami says is, could we potentially have wage inflation, by which I think he means wage push inflation, which that actually, it doesn't mean is the wage itself inflated, but it means do higher wages cause inflation, because it would put more money into the hands of people who don't have a lot of money who would then spend it. I actually think that is a valid concern, because but it's because I think of the story told here differently. I think of the story as like the main protagonist, the protagonist being the low wage worker. And I would actually be very concerned if there's inflation because of rising wages, because it would devalue that very rise in wages we've just seen, right? If your dollar now is, just because you got the increase to $15 an hour, if that very income might now be only worth $13 an hour a year ago. So that's the thing. It could be such an important conversation, and it could be such an important issue that's brought up there. But then in the second answer, you immediately see what the concern here is and whose perspective we're looking at, which is the perspective of an investor who only cares about returns on investment.
And that's what margin pressure is, right?
Margin pressure is they're going to make less money. That's the difference between
what we spend and what we're making, and that's our margin. And if we pay more, our margin's smaller. We're still making the same amount of money, that kind of thing.
It just means it's going to be, these companies are going to be less profitable because they're now paying their workers more. And I'm not even mad at these people. Like it's just the way the system is constructed. And
but that storytelling is so powerful. I mean, this is why I found your point of view so fascinating and interesting, because this kind of conversation goes on unremarked every single day on CNBC, on Fox Business, in the Wall Street Journal. All of this stuff is happening at all times, and never is the story told the way you just were telling it.
I think, well, this is maybe because I talk to a lot of economists, but I'm in the heterodox economics field. So I know a lot of people who are doing work in economics that is trying to get away from these kinds of narratives. And sometimes I am pretty hopeful. When Yellen said that she supports a global tax on businesses, global corporate tax, I almost fell off my chair. I felt like that showed that something is changing.
So I want to call back to the article you read at the start. You're talking about economic models, like the concept of perfect competition. And you write, and I'm quoting here, without the novel first teaching us how to deal with worlds that are not technically true, but still believable, theoretical models might not exist in the way they do today. I just love that idea of novels being technically not true, but believable. I'm not sure I've ever heard that definition, but it feels perfect to me. So how does it apply to economics?
First, I want to say this is coming from Catherine Gallagher's amazing work on, and she really tells us, she really shows how fiction in the early 18th century just had a completely different, just was conceived completely differently than it was later in the century. And that it really like got people attuned to believing, for example, in paper money as a representation of gold, for example. But yeah, to the question of how is this applied in economics, I think to some degree you could say about any hypothesis that it is technically not true but believable, right? Any kind of moment where you imagine something that you then want to construct a study out of requires that mechanism of fiction. That's why it's maybe not that interesting to say this. What I think is interesting about economics is that this fictional mechanism is baked into their assumptions. So the story of opportunity cost, for example, that I talk about in the article, is incredibly fundamental. It's in the quantitative social sciences, it's still the basic assumption. When people talk about the rationality assumption, this is what they mean, this kind of decision making, where you imagine someone who has to decide between like different options. How do I allocate the next hour of my time? And in your head, you're doing this calculation. Here are my three options. Option 3 is the best one. Option 2 would be the second best one, but I'm going to go with option 3. And I'm losing out on this fictional second option that in economics, basically a thing that never happened is still so real that it is considered a cost.
And I feel like when we write, or when I talk to my students about writing, some of what you're describing, I try to avoid the language of capitalism, but the language of choice, talking about how characters make decisions is very much how I talk about stories. What are they giving up? And have they actually given anything up? Or even the way that people talk about futures, right? Which is the language of writers commenting on each other's work, or even readers as they're thinking, what are the futures I'm predicting here? Like, what are the possible outcomes? And which is also the language of economics. And it's, it was very briefly someone who covered the economy. And I remember sort of realizing that the economy was actually really interesting if you paid attention to it in this way. Like, they both have really specific relationships, both fiction and the economy, really specific relationships to time. The way that the speed at which it moves forward, the way in which sort of different kinds of bets are placed. I don't know, this is such an interesting analogy to me. And I think, although I'm certainly going to go back in the classroom, continue to avoid talking about the real estate of my students' stories. I was trying to eradicate this language.
Units of happiness aren't real, but they're really important in economic theory, as Carolin was saying. Yeah. But like, character arcs aren't real either. We talk about those all the time, right? They're an integral part of how a novel is made.
Yeah.
Whitney Terrell has a really beautiful essay on The Rise of Silas Lapham, a novel, a 19th century realist novel. And she opens it kind of with this meditation of, isn't every novelist an economist, in the sense that they have to allocate you have to decide what resources in the book are going to go to whom, and even just the resource of how much space do you give this character versus this character. So I thought I highly recommend that essay.
We'll put it in our show notes. Listeners, look for it there.
Absolutely. All right. So let's say I'm a person who does not watch CNBC, or God forbid, Fox Business, where the money honey reigns supreme. Do you know who that is?
I do not.
They talk about Maria Bartiromo, who is sort of Trump shows up on her show all the time, and people call her the money honey. I'm not making this up. This is not my sexist terminology. I'm sorry. Or read the Wall. It is funny. Yeah. Or read the Wall Street Journal. I don't have a Robinhood account. I have a Charles Schwab account. I could care less about the stock market. Imagine that I'm a person who doesn't have any of these things, right? Other than the terror the stock market has, other than this terror that the stock market has for rising wages, which are good for most people, what other kinds of economic stories are equally deceptive? How can I learn to read economists better? And I have a follow-up after you answer this.
I mean, I'm kind of like that. I don't have a Robinhood account, although I briefly thought about it in the GameStop, when GameStop happened. But I think actually the most important thing is to remember that economics is not, whenever economists tell you something, even though it sounds very authoritative, they're not talking to you about physical facts of nature. They're telling you their interpretation of relationships between humans, social relationships. And that means that whenever they say something, that also can have an impact on how these relationships change. And I'm saying this because that simple fact, the very idea that someone like an economist tells you, here's what the economy looks like, and I'm using all these fancy terms, and it's going to be really hard for you to follow. That's the thing that turns people off from it. That's the reason that very smart people will not start studying economics while they're in college. And it breaks my heart because it would need much more of the people in economics, I think, to make it better. I don't have anything against the studies, and even some of the stories that I don't agree with, I don't have anything against them. My problem is that some of them are too powerful. And I just wish that more people would come to economics who would question that and who will tell other stories.
I want to just shout out briefly to UMKC, where I teach. University of Missouri Kansas City has a heterodox economics department, and Stephanie Kelton was a member of this department up until recently. And then she left to go be in charge. She's
in New York now, right?
Of Bernie's. She was the economist for Bernie's last campaign, Bernie Sanders. So we have some familiarity with that here. Now, you said you don't want to make predictions, but I do want to know, we're talking about the Biden boom. Is it going to happen or not?
I think there's going to be a boom. I honestly don't think it's going to be because of Biden. I think it's going to be because now there's a vaccine, and I mean, a boom can only exist because there was a bust, and that was last year was a huge bust. So there is going to be a boom. Anything happening now directly afterwards is going to feel like a boom, I think. But I'm not an economist, and I have no idea, and that's just my story.
Well, I don't know. That sounds right to me.
I like that story.
It sounds realistic.
I like, but the best part about it is that low wages in the low wage sector are rising, and that's the thing I care most about.
Yeah, I think it's going to be, that's the most interesting part of reading the economic news for me right now, is hearing how those folks are talking about, like the service industry, joblessness, the ways that certain portions of that conversation are erased or reframed. So the idea that economics...
I want to, before you go on to that, are you going on to that? I want to just say one thing that what you just were speaking about made me think of.
Yeah.
To investigate, is there a possibility that this Biden boom will be different than other ones, that like the Reagan era, which was about cutting taxes and getting government out of things and not giving people money, right? In other words, booms tend to increase economic disparity. In the past, the ones that I think about and look at, right? 1920s. Right, or the Reagan era, or even the 90s. But I wonder if because of Biden's actual policies, that he's giving people money directly, right, that he's looking to do all these, the infrastructure bills, if it gets passed, is supposed to help people who don't have college degrees, right? Is there some chance that this boom will actually help those lower wage workers that you are talking about?
I think that's a really great question. And there are things that make me hopeful. I do think, to me, Reagan to Obama is anything happening between Reagan and Obama was following the logic of neoliberalism. And that, I don't mean that as an insult. I just mean,
usually mean it as an insult on this program.
I mean, just I should just specify what I mean by it, because I didn't use the term for a really long time because it means so much to different people. What I mean by neoliberalism is just that the logic that the state is there to prop up a free market and, you know, keep out of it as much as possible. Other than that, I think that logic has changed since the Trump administration. Under the Trump administration, I think the primary logic, I mean, I know a lot of libertarians and economists who thought Trump was an absolute disaster because he, in a way, upended a lot of the macroeconomic, like a lot of the held beliefs about what good economic policy looks like. Because I think the primary logic of that administration was race, in the sense of Trump had to appeal to his base. And now we are in a period, it's just so interesting to see that Biden, who was in the Obama administration, which I think was still operating under this neoliberal logic, I think now he is operating under a different logic. And I think it's very fascinating. It's one that does, I think, more actively look into, or more actively redistribute wealth. And I think that's a huge win for the left and for the progressive movements, you know, especially I think it's due to Bernie Sanders in many ways. And that makes me hopeful that the boom that we're going to be experiencing is not going to be one that's just going to increase the wealth gap again. But I'm not going to make a prediction. I'm just going to mention a few things I see that I think could be good signs.
I'm reminded as you're talking about an article that I read, and I promise our listeners, I will try and figure out what this was for the show notes. And it was about sort of how the future of the world was going to consist of increased instability, in part because of increased unhappiness in leaders who want certain things to happen, but have an inability to deliver. And so populations that are less and less satisfied. And that the boom strikes me as possibly one version of that for Biden, that, you know, maybe that there are things that he would like to happen for the economy. Maybe they will happen in ways that don't have that much to do with him. I was online and saw someone commenting, there's a lot of kind of, a lot of feelings. People have a lot of feelings about the CDC's recent saying that, you know, fully vaccinated people need not wear masks either indoors or outdoors. And I saw someone comment, I was like, oh God, maybe this is true. It was sort of like, well, maybe the CDC just saw us lining up with plastic bags at gas stations to hoard gas and they just gave up. I was like, that's terrible. And also just, I don't know, I saw these images as well, you know, and then someone was saying, you know, the same.
Wait, I just want to say those Snopes guys, those are not from now.
The plastic bag ones?
Yeah. I think so. We'll double check.
We'll double check this.
I thought I saw something on Twitter saying that from Snopes saying those were images from 2019.
Okay. Then sort of some of the social media rhetoric around this was also stuff like, you know, the same people who won't get vaccinated are the same people with plastic bags of gasoline in their houses. Also, you know, apocryphal. We don't know if this is true, but like we have for a long time on this podcast on the way out sort of asked people to make predictions. You know, what do you think is coming? And as the world becomes less and less predictable, climate change, the economy, all of that, it's interesting to see who's willing to dabble in futures. Who's having
Chicago
it would be a little hypocritical if I did that, because I'm saying, you know, if someone wants to authoritatively speak on the future, they should be very careful. And so I am.
So the idea that economics is more literature than science seems obvious and thrilling to us. We host a podcast about how everything in politics has already been covered in literature. We are the choir, but it's not so obvious to mainstream opinion or the academy or economists. So I'm curious, how do you get involved in this convergence of disciplines, and how did you convince Duke that you should study this?
I kind of started at the American Studies Institute I was at the Free University of Berlin, the John F. Kennedy Institute. He just kind of studies 6 different disciplines like at the same time. And so I think the funny thing is we were being taught by people who were very disciplinary, right? Who were very in their discipline, but I think they didn't really know what they were doing to us, which is that to us, we just started seeing all these like convergences, right? Like, I mean, the first year you study everything from literature and culture to economy at the same time. And I think that just made us all of us see connections fairly easily. Now, for me, I was just always really interested in both, and I thought I wasn't smart enough to study economics. Even though I was always good at math, I just always thought, I didn't realize that was a very gendered thought, that I wasn't, that I thought I wouldn't
I was
make
just
it.
thinking that.
No, it's absolutely, in hindsight, I know. But well, literature is also a really important thing to me. So it just kind of a moment where I realized that I can study both, and that the economy and literature actually have quite a lot to do with each other was when I took a class at UC Irvine. I was doing exchange year in Irvine, and I took a class with Richard Godden and on like Marxism and literature. And so I started realizing, oh, I can actually do these two things together. And then it just kind of became a challenge. And then I started studying economics as well, because I was like, well, all these things, all these critiques make so much sense. Why are economists, why does it seem like whenever anyone speaks to economists, any critique kind of just seems to fall off of them, and they don't even kind of take it seriously. And so I thought, okay, well, then I want to study economics as well and understand where they're coming from. I think that's how it happened. How did I convince Duke? It didn't need much convincing. I just they're very interdisciplinary. I'm lucky that like a lot of faculty are really into this, and I actually have an economist on my committee as well. But it wasn't that hard. But it was also the only school where I got accepted. And I think it's because that was also the only school where it was easy to write the statement of purpose, where it didn't feel like I was stretching the truth or anything.
Well, look, it's been fascinating to talk to you. I also, you write about Frank Norris. I don't know, when did you start reading him?
No, this was still back in Berlin. Yeah, I mean, he's fascinating, right?
And he's really good on all these subjects, but not a lot of people read him these days. So I was
that's funny. I don't know. I think I was like, there was a research group at the Kennedy Institute that was that looked at the late 19th century a lot, and so that's how I got introduced to Norris. Norris is so, I mean, I wish he'd finished his trilogy on the wheat, on wheat production and consumption. Unfortunately, he didn't. It's also incredible that someone can die at 32 and have already, and he already had written so much stuff. So,
isn't the first book of that The Octopus? Is that the okay.
Yeah, The Octopus, and then The Pit, and then the third one I think was supposed to be called The Wolf. It's going to be about the bread consumption in I think Europe, the bread that was made from the wheat that started in California.
Now there's an economic story.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating.
Carolin, thank you so much for joining us. Listeners, we encourage you to check out her writing, and we'll put links to her articles in the show notes.
Thank you both so much for having me. It was really fun talking.
Carolin, thanks so much.